So everyone, we're going to be starting in about 4 minutes time. So sit back and just wait a couple of more minutes and we'll get started. All right, good day everybody, and thank you for joining us. We'll get started in about a minute or so, but before we do, we thought we'd start with a quick poll question, just to see how many of you still working from home at the moment. So I know that the last couple of months have been certainly very, very interesting for people working in our industry, and so we thought we'd just get started with this quick question, and we'll share the results. At the moment, it looks like it's pretty much 50-50. Quite a lot of you are still working from home. Some of you are obviously back in the office, and a few of you are actually doing a bit of both. So in terms of class, as I end this poll and just show the results to you, we are certainly at the moment still very much at home. We've been here since March, and whilst there's a plan to have some of us return to work in the next couple of months as part of a trial, I don't think that the whole company is going to be back, all of us, at least until the end of the year. So certainly a very, very different time, but thankfully for us, class application is entirely in the cloud, and so certainly makes it a lot easier to be able to transfer the work you were doing back in the office and transform your living room, if you like mine, myself at home, into your new office. So I think we might get started. We've hit 2 o'clock, so let's get straight into it. Well, I guess first of all, oh, apologies, let me just share my screen with you. So I'll share that with you now. So yeah, look, first of all, thank you very much for joining us today. Today we're going to be covering the topic of reviewing automation for a fund. Now, we know that many of you have been really busy over the last couple of months, and so we wanted to pick a topic that would help you save some time, hopefully ensure that over the next 12 months you can be processing funds as quickly as possible and making the most out of the class software. So my name is Sebastian Brennan. I'm one of the consultants here at Class. Apologies. My screen is just stuck. Sorry, I'll try that again. There we go. Yeah, so my name is Sebastian Brennan. I'm one of the consultants here at Class, and my role predominantly involves working with practices that are using Class to help them to get the most value out of the Class software. And certainly today's topic of automation of a fund plays an important part of getting that value out of Class software. I've also got my colleague Carla, who's sitting in on this webinar today, and she'll be here to answer any questions that you have throughout the webinar. And I might also pick a few questions to answer at the end of the webinar as well. So today's webinar, we'll be looking at 4 different areas. So we'll start by looking at how to review a fund on Class. And then we'll shift our attention to understanding automation in Class so that you'll be able to distinguish between a fund that's been processed entirely manually on Class to one that's been processed leveraging the full automation of the Class software. And what we typically find is that a lot of the funds that we're reviewing as consultants are somewhere in between those 2 ends of the spectrum. So if there are opportunities for you to improve how you're processing funds, we'll look at what specific Class features you can leverage in the next section when we talk about the different transaction categories. And finally, we'll equip you with some tools to help you apply knowledge from today's webinar, including a brand new fact sheet that we've created that's specific to this topic. And we'll share that with you so that you're easily able to review a fund. And particularly the automation level. We'll also, at the end of today's webinar, have a look at a fund together. So we'll go through a review, and I'll be looking at the Class software as well with you guys as we go through the various topics. So I might get started with the next poll question of the day, and we just want to know with regards to the role that you have with Class. So what is your main role? Are you someone that is mainly processing funds on Class? Are you someone that is entirely reviewing funds? Or does your role cover doing both? So I'll keep this poll up for a little bit and then we'll share the results. So thank you all for that. So it looks like most of you are saying you are doing a bit of both. So we've got 54% both, 31% are just processing, and 13% of you are mainly just reviewing the funds. So certainly today's topic is relevant for both types of users or people who, don't use Class and are predominantly just reviewing. So let's go into the next section. So reviewing a fund. Well, typically a review of fund involves checking for errors. So you're making sure that things are correctly classified in the financials and tax return. Basically your job is to make sure nothing's been missed. And certainly from my own experience, when I worked in public practice, the process that I followed was that once the fund was finished, I'd hand the completed set of financials and work papers to my manager or the partner, and they'd just be checking to make sure that things look correct. Now, what I'd encourage you to do is take a slightly different approach. And as your first step, you should be using the Class software to perform your review. And so the suggested workflow for that is to go, once you've done a period update, is to go into the dynamic reports and then look at your report pack. So I know that not all of you are Class users necessarily, Some of you may just be reviewing the software, sorry, reviewing the funds that are produced. So let me just jump into class and show you what we mean by this process. So looking at my fund here, the period update is what you do at year end. Apologies, just been logged out. So yeah, the period update is what you do at year end once your fund has been finalised. And so once you've done that, you can go to the live reports, and these are the ones that show up here. Now, with that, what you want to be doing is looking at, say, your statement of financial position and your operating statement. Now, you do have with this report the ability to drill down into specific transaction types, and that's what makes this particular functionality really important to someone who's reviewing a fund. Because if there's a particular figure that you're not sure of, you can quickly drill down and understand what comprises that. And so if you're doing that here in class as a dynamic check, then if you do find something that has been misallocated, that something is missing, you're easily able to roll back your period update, make a change to your transactions, and rerun that report. So dynamic reports is certainly the first part of your review. The second part of your review is to run a report package. Now, the report package is the report that you've set up at the business level. In our case, we've got a sample SMSF report pack, and that will have all the financials, the tax return, and the various single reports. And that's kind of your last check to make sure that everything looks okay. But today's focus is not on that type of a review. Today's webinar is about reviewing the automation of a fund. And so if we look at the next slide, for someone who's processing a fund, you should be really checking the automation and checking how well you've processed the fund pretty much every time you've completed the fund. For someone who's reviewing, you might have a team of a couple of people, and you probably want to be checking every single person, probably a couple of times a year as well. So how do we do that check? So on this slide, we've got the instructions of what you would do, and there's actually a short video that's been attached to this image. So if you do want to have a look at that after today's webinar, you'll be able to click on the image. But again, let's jump into class and do it together. So we're going to start at transactions, and we're going to look at our browse events. So from here, what we want to do is look at the group by status. We're going to change that to created by. And then I'm also going to drag the type. Now, the reason I do that is because if I look at some of these transactions, in this case, 130 transactions, it's really difficult for me to analyze what's happened here. Too many transactions. So by dragging the type next to created by, as soon as I see the plus symbol, so you'll notice the plus symbol is there, then when I click on that, I get a much better understanding of the individual transactions that will be processed and what category they are under. So this is the process we want to follow in order to do a review of the fund. So again, let's jump back to our presentation and focus now on the next poll question. We just want to know here, how often are you, well, let me just bring up the poll question first. So the question here is, how often do you review a fund to determine the level of automation? So specifically here, we're focusing on the level of automation, not just how often are you reviewing a fund. The assumption is that you're going to be reviewing a fund for errors every time. But the question here is really focusing on the level of automation for a specific fund. And it's relevant, again, whether you're someone that's just processed the fund or whether you are the person who is reviewing. So we'll keep this open for a couple more moments. I've got about half of you that have responded at the moment. So thank you for that. I'll share the I'll share these results with you. So we've got 30% of you are saying yearly, 25% are saying never, 22% are saying a couple of times a year, 14% each fund. So we do know that the majority of you answered that you were processing or doing a bit of both, but it looks like not as many of you are actually looking at that level of automation. So a couple of you are, but we can certainly increase that. So hopefully out of today, what you'll get is a thorough understanding of how to do a review and then actually implement that in your practice. Okay, so let's move on to our next area. So we're going to look at understanding the automation. So what we've got here are our created by statuses. Now these are all the statuses that you'll encounter in that previous screening class. So just going back here, these are these statuses here. And what we're going to do now is explain what each of them mean and also understand where transactions come from if they've got this particular status. So with the first one, automated feed, that one is, I guess, pretty obvious. We're talking about transactions that have come from a data feed. So we've got our bank, broker, our wrap data feed transactions. As well as this, we've also got classes superstream. So any transactions that come through classes superstream, they're going to have the automated feed status. What action does a user need to take in order to create these transactions? They don't need to take any action. The transactions will appear on a nightly basis without the user doing anything. The second area is auto transaction rules. So auto transaction rules are transaction rules with our bulk processing ticked. So when you set up a transaction rule, you do have that option of ticking the bulk processing. For those of you that are not familiar, I might just jump into class and show you what that looks like. So if we're looking at a transaction rule, that's this one here, bulk processing. You can see it's ticked. If we actually look at a transaction rule, it's this thing at the bottom. So some people we speak to, they're not really sure what that does. If you set this, it runs a transaction rule overnight every night without you needing to actually run the event. So that's what that means. And again, in terms of user action, none required for this one. The next one is transaction rules. So these differ from the earlier one in that they don't have the bulk processing ticked. So the user action here is that the user still needs to run the transaction rules in the match transaction screen. Your income announcements are your generate income. So these are all your dividends, your distributions, whether that be for your domestic listed securities, your ETFs, your managed funds, foreign shares. And for these ones, the user action depends. So if you've got a broker feed set up, you do not need to do anything. The system will generate your income and match it off. If you don't have a broker feed set up, you will need to firstly generate income. So click the generate income and then click auto match to generate those transactions. The corporate action, they're pretty self-explanatory. Those are the actions, sorry, they're the transactions, sorry, that come from the corporate action console, be it the business level or the fund level. And the action here, again, it depends on the type of corporate action, but you'd be processing the corporate action, and then you would have the auto match as well. So the auto match is going to be in the situation where the transaction results in a cash event. So manual feed. Manual feeds are transactions that come from the Excel transaction loader. So the action here is to load the transactions through the loader and then run auto match. Modified by super IP. You might find that sometimes. Now, super IP is actually classes, transactions that class has pushed into your business. Whilst it's been modified, it hasn't actually been modified by you as a user. And modified by auto match, some of you are probably familiar with the fit to cash, particularly with things like managed fund distributions. If there's a difference between the business event and the cash received, and that difference is within 50 cents either direction, you can use a fit to cache functionality, and that would appear as a modified by auto match. The modified by user email are transactions where a user has modified any of the above transaction types. So the user has edited that, and the final one is where a user creates an event that will have a user's email attached to the transaction. So quite a lot to digest here. What we've done in the next slide is just summarize that into different groups, so it's a bit easier to understand, and we're going to focus on those groups. So again, the way to read this, we'll go through the first one together. So these statuses are the same status as we saw before, but we've just grouped them. So the first group are system generated transactions, and they include our automated feed, our auto transaction rules, and our modified by super IP transactions. These give us the highest level of automation. We don't want to reduce these types of transactions because they're already as automated as they can be, and the exception column doesn't apply to this particular group of transactions. So they're the ideal transaction types to achieve. The second group, system automated. So system automated are transactions where there is a high degree of automation, but the user still might need to do something. So in the case of transaction rules, they need to run transaction rules. In the case of income announcements, they need to click generate income. And in the case of corporate actions, they need to run the corporate action. So still a little bit of work to do, but still a high level of automation. How can we reduce transactions from this category and push them to the category above? Well, we can firstly activate more broker feeds. And secondly, we can set the transaction rules to bulk where applicable. Now, we don't just want to go and do that for every transaction rule, just the ones where it would be relevant to do that. Again, exceptions, they don't apply to this column. The manual feed, so again, these are going to be the manual feed transactions. And we have here a medium level of automation. So with these ones, to reduce those types of transactions, again, we can look at activating more broker and wrap feeds. And in terms of exceptions, well, we've got some, these are the types of transactions you would expect to see as a manual feed. So where you've got unlisted trades, unlisted securities, the buys and sell, these ones you probably want to see as a manual feed. And where you're setting up a data feed, but it doesn't support history, and you want to backfill the missing transactions, that one would also, you'd expect to use a transaction loader for that. In terms of system modified, these are transactions that are modified by a user. So not the ones that are modified by class, but by a user. These will give us a medium to lower level of automation. To reduce those, we want to improve the quality of our transaction rules. And certainly my experience working with a lot of practices, there are many practices that can make improvements to the quality of their transaction rules. A lot of the time what happens is that rules just don't get touched. So once they've been set up, they get forgotten about, and you end up with rules that are not quite good, and they start processing transactions that they shouldn't. So instead of processing the transaction they've been designed to pick up, they start processing other transaction types. And what happens then is that the user has to go in, edit the transaction, and that's when you get the system modified by user transaction. So exceptions, many of you are probably aware that class does support dividend reinvestments and distribution reinvestments. And I think for about 60% of our broker feeds now, that is automated. But for the 40% that is not, you need to edit the income event. And so that will result in a system modified transaction. So if you've got heaps of those transactions, there's nothing you can do if the broker feed does not currently support it. It will just have to be a modified transaction. The final one are your user email transactions. These are obviously the lowest level of automation. To reduce these, we can look at setting up transaction rules. We can also, again, increasing the number of data feeds that we have. So certainly a theme that you'll notice here is that setting up more data feeds is going to solve a lot of our issues in terms of automation. Exceptions. So these are the types of transactions where it's okay to use a user-created transaction. So where you've got single pensions or contributions, where you've got tax statements, including the tax statement console, that will provide you a user email as the status when you look at the created by status, and the rollovers and tax payments, you have to create the transaction manually there. So how do we summarize all of this? How do we digest all of this information? Well, what you should be targeting are their first three categories. That's what we're looking for. And we're looking for an average of 80% across funds that are processed in our business that fall into one of these three categories. So what I might do, I know there's a few questions that have been coming through. I might just pause and have a look at one or two. So there's a question here, does class provide a report on the automation status for entire business, or is it done at an individual fund level to understand the efficiencies? The short answer to that is that the review has to be done at a fund level. In terms of what you can do at a business level, there is the ability to review and process transactions using the various business level consoles. And so you can certainly enhance or increase the level of automation by using those consoles. So things like the corporate actions at the business level, the cash console, monitoring your transaction rules at a business level. But in terms of understanding the automation, that's reviewed at a fund level at the moment. So I might come back to some other questions a little bit later on. Okay, so let's proceed to our next slide. So we're now going to look at transaction categories. So for those of you who are doing all the things perfectly, you're using the class software to its capability, then the next part is just going to be a recap of what you're doing. But for a lot of you, you'll find that there are opportunities to improve. And what I want you to do is pay attention. If there's something you're not doing for a particular transaction class, make a note of it, and then you can come back to it after the webinar. So what we're going to do is look at the different transaction types, obviously the most common ones. We're going to start by looking at the investment transactions. So these are we're going to start with the listed securities, your managed funds, your ETFs, and we're looking at the buys and sells. So the first way we want to get those transactions in is via the data feed. So setting up a broker wrap feed if we can. If that's not possible, the next alternative is to use the transaction loader. Now, a lot of people we speak to are a little bit hesitant to use the transaction loader. So I'll make a couple of points about that. Firstly, if you want to know how to use it, we did have a webinar on that a couple of months ago, and that's still available for you to access. So I encourage you to have a look if you're not confident on how to use a transaction loader. The second point is that if you've got, say, at least a half dozen trades, as soon as you've got a half dozen trades, it's more economical, it's more efficient to process those trades using the transaction loader compared to manually doing those transactions. Now, that's regardless of whether you can get a summary, a CSV summary from the broker or not. I mean, if you can, that's going to be even more efficient for you because you can just copy the data and paste it into the relevant columns. But even if you don't, typing the information into Excel sheet is going to be quicker and being able to tab to the next line than creating a new screen, entering the information in class, saving it, closing it, opening a new one, and doing that again. So if you've got 6 transactions or more, then use the transaction loader. If you're not sure how to use it, have a look at our previous webinar on that. So foreign, same sort of thing here, except that you're probably going to find less of our broker feeds are supporting foreign transactions. So you're going to be pushed towards using that transaction loader. Just remember to have the exchange, the market exchange code, which you can enter into the loader if you're going to use that for foreign transactions. Unlisted trades, obviously you need to use the transaction loader, and the manual transactions are going to be things like your term deposits, your property acquisitions, and any custom holding transactions. So these are your investment transactions. The next category is the investment income. So hopefully all of you are familiar with generate income and how class will generate your income based on the balances that are currently in class in terms of quantity for each of your securities. So that will generate your income for listed securities, including foreign. For unlisted securities though, what you want to use is auto transaction rules. So you want to set up a transaction rule, set it to run in bulk. It doesn't matter if you have not got the actual distribution or the dividend statement from that unlisted security, because you can just reconcile any tax components in the tax statements at year end. And so you can easily just have it set to run in bulk automatically. With rental income, when we see what people have done, there's generally two approaches. So one is that, and it kind of depends on the situation, right? So let's take a situation where the rent is paid 100% into the super fund and the expenses are paid out of the super fund separately. In that situation, it's very easy to just make those transaction rules, auto transaction rules, to record the gross rent and then the expenses. But if you have a situation which is more common where the agent pays the net rent to the super fund account, what we would suggest is you set up a transaction rule for that net rent. So you can set it to auto transaction rule. And then what you want to do is record the manual expenses, gross them up to the rent, either quarterly if the fund is registered for GST, or annually if it's not. So that's what you want to do for the rent. So at least the majority of the transactions are going to be automated. Interest, you'll find a lot of interest transaction rules class has already created for you. So they're a community created rule that we push out. And if we don't have that, then you just set up a transaction rule and set it to bulk. That's the income side. The member income. So importantly, you should be seeing all employer contributions coming through Class's SuperStream. If you've got Class's SuperStream set up, you will have a transaction rule, sorry, not a transaction rule. You will have a data feed that then brings in those transactions and matches them off to the cash. Now, the comment I get quite a lot here is that, oh, well, we've got SuperStream, but we've also got a lot of related party entities. And when the related party is paying themselves as a member their super, they just pay it directly. And that's fine, you can do that. But the thing is, it's still going to be probably more efficient for that related party to set up Class's SuperStream and pay those transactions using Class's SuperStream address, because then you'll know when you get to year end which member the payment relates to, what amount it was for, what period it was for. So from an audit perspective, certainly a lot more reliable and less need for documentation. So I encourage you to set up SuperStream, and this is something you've got to constantly look at. You might have set it up 2 years ago, but how many members have changed jobs? And are you keeping on top every time they change job? Are you giving them the Class SuperStream address? They're the things you need to think about. Member contributions. So for these ones, if it's a regular contribution, auto transaction rule, that's fine. If it's irregular, once a year, manual is fine. So that's our member income. There's a few more categories we're going to look at. Member payments. So here we've got transaction rules. Now I haven't got auto transaction rules because the suggestion here is to be really looking at your pensions on an annual basis. You probably really need to think about what strategy you're adopting, and you don't just want it to automatically process next year's pensions without you checking it. So having a transaction rule which you generate enables you to check before you process the transactions. As I mentioned before, lump sum, rollovers, commutations, they're all going to have to be manual. And insurance, if you're paying insurance premium for a single member, then auto transaction rule is fine. But we do find some situations where the transaction rule needs to be split between members because one premium is paid for two members. In that case, it's a good idea not to turn on auto transaction rules, so not to set it for bulk, but still have the rule, because you can then specify the split each year. So it might be that it's a dollar amount goes to member A and a certain dollar amount goes to member B. You can split that and then again check it at the period where the anniversary date and the premium changes. You can just edit that rule without it just automatically rolling on. So the last area is our fund income and expenses. Now, here we've got some transactions that are generally one-offs. Sometimes, particularly if you've set up reoccurring accounting or administration fees, that's excellent. But if you haven't, if they're one-off, accounting, ASIC, administration, and audit fees are all transactions you want to be processing using the cash console. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. The tax transactions, so whether it's the annual payment, activity statements, they're going to be manual. You're going to have to be manual. And bank fees, investment fees, those can be set to auto transaction rules. So again, appreciate a lot to take in, but hopefully what you can do is you've identified some areas where you need to go back to. And I encourage you, whether it's as a team or individually, going back through those areas and understanding how you can apply those functionalities to the funds you're processing going forward. So I just mentioned then the cash console. I just want to gauge how many of you are using that cash console at the moment. So we're going to run another poll. So never, daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, or yearly. If you don't know what the cash console is, that's fine. I will show you in a moment. But I just want to gauge from you where you're at the moment. So we'll just wait a few more moments for you to answer. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and show the results. Okay, so 50% have never used it. 12% are using it monthly, 11% quarterly, 10% yearly, and then 16% of you are using it either daily or weekly. So for those of you that are not using it or not using it necessarily as often, let me show you some use cases for that. So let's jump back into our business level. Sorry, I'll stop sharing the poll first. And I'll jump back to our cash console. So we're going to use the cash console at the business level. So what I'm going to do is go to transactions and cash console. Now, there are a couple of use cases for the cash console, and I'm not going to go into a lot of depths here as to the different ways, but I'm just going to show you two quick ways that we can use it. So first of all, we've got the feeds mode and all cash mode. Now, all cash mode is just all cash transactions. Okay. Now, if I put something in the search bar, so I'm going to search, for example, ASIC, and I'm going to go back to the last 2 years and look for any transaction that is in class for any funds in our business with this description for that date range. So I've gone refresh, and it's come up with 3 particular transactions. Now, why don't I want to set up a transaction rule for this? Well, take the third example. The third example, it's for $134. Now, this one actually has a component that's a penalty, as well as a component that's a regulatory fee. So if I just set up a transaction rule, my problem is that if it matches things like this, I'm going to have to undo it to reclassify it correctly. So I'd rather not have a rule and just use the cash console at the business level to say, well, show me all the ASIC payments. And I know what amounts I'm looking for. So $54, that was the payment for last year. So if I select those two, I'm going to use the bulk classify cash function. And if I do that, I have the option of choosing how to classify this. And in this case, I'm just going to go regulatory fee and classify selected items. And that way, it's going to match those transactions off. So what created by status is that going to produce for me? It's actually going to produce a user email. So we're still getting efficiencies from using the cash console, but one of the difficulties is understanding when we have used it. So unfortunately, it's not possible to tell just by looking at the transactions. You've actually got to ask the person what they did. The other use case, though, for the transaction, so it's for the cash console, is to use it to create transaction rules. And if you create transaction rules from here, the status will actually be auto transaction rule. So I'm now going to look at another example with our audit fees. Now, again, I would probably in this case, given it's a single one-off payment, I just want to be matching those off using the bulk classify. But if, for example, I wanted to set up a transaction rule for bank fees, I could search that, select all the funds I want to set up the rule for, and then set it up from here. So if you are going to go through a cleanup of some of your transaction rules and want to set up new rules going forward, this could be a good option for you. But again, I'm just going to show you audit. So bulk classify, it's going to be a fund, general expense, and I'm going to go and select my auditor fee. I classified those. So that's how we use the cash console. As I mentioned, use it for your accounting fees, your audit fees, your ASIC fees. Have one person in particular become familiar with the cash console and use it periodically as required. So the more funds you have, probably the more often you're going to want to use this function. So let's go back to our presentation. All right, so the last topic or the last area is the next step. So I did mention that we had created a new fact sheet for you, and we will give you an actual copy of the fact sheet after today's webinar. But here is an example of what it looks like. So what it's doing is it's actually taking the first 3 areas that we talked about today and putting them together into one page fact sheet that you can then use to review your funds automation. So you've got the created by category. So we talked about what all these categories mean. We've also talked about the method that a transaction is created and how it produces that category. And then on the left side, you've got the types of transactions. So the way to review this is that what we're saying is that a rental income, which is an investment income transaction, you should be seeing the auto transaction rule as the created by status. And the way that you would create that is by creating a transaction rule and set it to bulk processing. So what we want you to do is to cross-check, okay, I've got some listed security transactions, some buys and sells. The status I have might be a user email, right? And what this is saying is, well, we're suggesting best practice is automated feed or manual feed, depending on which one is available to you. So use this fact sheet to help you review your funds. And that should give you a really good understanding of how you're doing and where you can focus on improvement. So the final section is what you can do next. Okay, so I encourage you, I know that there's a lot of you that said at the start today that you're someone that processes or you do processing and reviewing. So pick 3 funds, the last 3 funds you processed, and have a look at how you compare to the fact sheet and see how well you're doing and where there's opportunities for improvements. Okay, that's the other thing. So when you've gone through and identified potential areas, the best thing you could do is then have a catch up with your team, the team that is processing funds, and discuss what areas as a group you can look to improve at. And I mentioned as well a couple of times, there are some of the business level consoles that you can be using to help you achieve that automation, such as the cash console. And try and find someone in the team that wants to volunteer to kind of champion that area and get them to start processing that for all the funds. If you've got new users, so new users to your practice, buddy them up, have someone help them out as they're processing the first few funds. And don't just look at the financials, but also look at how well they've used the software. Because I've certainly seen examples where some funds, I've seen, I think, over 250 manual events created for dividend, for listed securities. So something which could have taken 3 or 4 seconds to create using the class functionality and the generate income, someone had spent probably over 2 hours doing that manually. So it can happen, particularly with new users that are not familiar with the application. And for your existing users, there's really no reason why you shouldn't be checking every user's a couple of times a year. So whether that's a buddy system or a manager's role, certainly I encourage the actual user to review their own fund, how they've processed it every time they've processed, but have someone else check also a couple of times a year. And the final part is to document some of these best practice expectations. Now, class can certainly share with you recommendations for best practices, things like the fact sheet. But I think there's always an element there that is going to be tailored to your practice and how you do things. And you're going to need to really document how you want to approach certain areas. And so I think that last part is a really important point to have with everyone. So the final thing I also did mention, I would review a fund with you guys. And so I'm going to do that now. And then we'll have an opportunity to go through some questions together. So let's have a look at a fund. We're going to be looking at, apologies, I'm just waiting it to load. So we're going to be looking at the fund, the Maillot Jaune. And I've just finished processing the fund for the year. And I want to look at how I've done in terms of automation. So transactions and browse events. And remember, we're going to go created by, and we're going to drag the type. Okay, so how do I start the review? The way I start it is by looking at what have I created using, with a user email. And so you can see here, I've created 8 transaction types. Now, these ones are familiar because remember I used the cash console to bulk classify these transactions as well as transactions in another fund. And so whilst it's got my email address, I'm confident that I did use the best possible manner to process those transaction types. And if I compare it to my fact sheet, this is the kind of created by status I'd be expecting to see. So with the other ones, what about these? Is this the correct category? Now, I've got a spin-off demerger. I did actually use the the corporate action console to process this. The reason it comes up with my name is that it created a new security, created Coles. And as soon as it creates a new security, it doesn't come up under the corporate action announcements. So again, that one's fine. Nothing wrong here. My member contribution. So if we look at it here, we've got 200,000 for Richie Port. It's a personal contribution. It's a one-off. So that one is fine as well. No issues there. The dividends though, the dividends are for listed securities. And so what I'm looking at here, if I look at the date, they're all around that July 2018. Now, what I haven't told you is this is a first year fund. And this is actually a very common situation. So what happens is that you go and generate your income and it doesn't create it for the securities where the ex-dividend date is prior to the fund start date on class. And so what I want to show you how to fix this. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to delete these transactions and we're going to reprocess them correctly. So if you see dividends for listed securities, that should be setting off some questions for you straight away. Now, what I'm going to do here is go to match transactions, and I'm going to go and generate income. And what you'll find is that whilst they don't come up here, I can tick this box, create announcements prior to opening position, and click refresh. Now you must click refresh, and that should create transactions for me, which it has. So you will only ever see this if the fund is in its first year on class. If it's been on class for more than a year, you won't see this, but class will know to generate that income event. Okay, so if you're new to processing on class, or your practice is new, or you've got a fund that's come on from another accountant, just keep an eye out for this little trick, and you can refresh. Sorry, I've already clicked that. You can create the income events, and then we can go and auto match those transactions, just match them off. So that's how we should be creating those types of events. If I look back at some other opportunities to improve, again, created by and type. So overall, it looks pretty good. I've got auto transaction rules, automated feeds, corporate action, income announcements. They're the majority of the transactions. My other potential concern might be transaction rules. So my question is, can I shift some of these from transaction rules to auto transaction rule by setting up the bulk processing? So my first one, member contributions. Okay, so this one, certainly an area I could improve. I could set up classes SMSF data flow, classes superstream, and then I wouldn't see these transactions come as transaction rule. They would actually come as auto transaction rule if they come from the feed. So sorry, not auto transaction rule, automated feed, sorry. But yeah, in this case, I don't really want to be seeing these in this manner. So what I'd be doing is I'd be sending out the superstream letter, which all of you should have in your single reports. So if you go to run a report, you're able to run the superstream report, and you could then send it out to that member. So it's possible, as I said, that you might have set this up in early days, but the member has now got a new job, forgot to tell you, and you haven't obviously sent them the letter. So this is the letter you want to run, superstream ESA notification, provide that to your member, get them to provide that to their employer, and just check it next time they get paid a contribution. The other one, drawdown, pension drawdown. Now I did mention that was fine to have not set to bulk because we want to check it each year. So no issues there. Bank fees though, now this one is a bit of a concern. I would expect that my auto transaction rules are used to process my bank fees. Now I want to understand why it hasn't been. So I'm going to look at my transaction rules under view transaction rules. That's under here, fund level. Now, interestingly, I actually have bulk processing turned on for my bank fees. So why is it that they're coming up as transaction rule? Now the reason, it's quite simple, it's because these transaction rules, these transactions were processed by me before I had set up the transaction rule. So what I did is I set up a transaction rule and got it to process for all the transactions it found that met that requirement. Now, if I was to pay a bank fee tomorrow out of this fund's bank account, the transaction rule would then look at processing this because it's got bulk processing turned on. And in that event, all my future bank fees would now have auto transaction rules. So anything I've processed to date hasn't, because it was processed by me clicking the run transaction rule. But anything in the future would now be correctly processed. So it's possible that you'll find situations like this where you look at it and you say, well, bulk processing wasn't turned on. And then you look at it here and you go, oh, well, it was turned on. It just means that it hasn't yet processed those transactions. And so that's it in terms of the review. I'm happy with everything else that I see here. So that's the end of my my fund review. So it's also the end of today's webinar. Hopefully you've found this useful. So what I'll do now, I might go through a couple of questions. Feel free, if you don't have any questions, to leave. We will send through a copy of the recording and the fact sheet. But for those of you that still have a couple of questions, stick around and we'll try and answer some of those. So there's a question about, is class able to incorporate find and recode function in the events that a lot of transactions have been allocated to an incorrect account? Jane, unfortunately, no, we don't have the ability to find transactions at a business level. I guess what you're talking about is there in that browse event screen. So the screen we've been looking at together, that's the one that kind of allows you to find the transactions that have been processed, and then you can delete them. So if you go back to this screen, as I mentioned before with a dividend, if I wasn't happy with transactions, I can certainly select them and I can either unmatch, which will just make the business event go back to the right-hand side of the match transaction screen, or I can just delete it, which will leave the cash event, but mean that I need to recreate the business event. So this is basically where you come, Jane, to review and redo the transactions. Another question, sometimes class does not generate tax statements in the tax statement console. Is there a reason for this? Are we doing something wrong in processing the transactions? So Napor, the answer to that is there could be a number of different possibilities. So the first one is double check that you've actually generated your distributions, because if you don't generate a distribution, you won't find your tax statement in your tax statement console. So that's the first thing to do. If you have done that, it's possible that class just doesn't support that tax statement. So if you're looking at tax statements now, we've pretty much processed all the tax statements now for the year. If you're looking at it in 3 weeks' time, the reason is probably that we just haven't got round to it yet. So what I would be doing then is looking at our user guide, our knowledge base, seeing if our that particular tax statement is listed as supported. If it isn't, and you've got a couple of funds that hold that particular security, you can always send us copies of those tax statements, and then we can support that tax statement going forward. So hopefully that answers your question that yes, you do need to make sure you've generated the income first. The other reason could be that if it's linked to a wrap, you won't be able to generate your tax statements in the tax statement console. And that's because wrap tax statements are very different to tax statements from single securities. And so we don't actually support that at all. So you would then need to use the wrap tax statement, which possibly might be supported through the data feed. If not, then you would need to look at manually importing it. So hopefully that answers your questions, Napor. Vusi, there's a question, if rent is grossed up quarterly or annually, would this have any impact on the pension exempt factor if, say, pension is commenced or ceased in the year, or if the fund becomes unsegregated from being segregated? So I guess with that, because you've matched off the net rent during your year, your cash position is unchanged. The only thing that's different is your classification. So you just haven't classified your expenses until the period where you've set up your pension. So no, it wouldn't necessarily have an impact on starting those pensions, but it would just be more of a classification issue, which you really are only necessarily concerned with at year end. Another question from Stephen about Vanguard investments. Distributions comes through are automatically reconciled using bank rules. However, there's also a tax statement associated with Vanguard investments, which at the moment is a manual function. Can and will this be made an automatic function? So I guess with that, it depends on the bank feed. So we do have a team that is always looking at how we can improve the functionality with our supported data feeds. And when we're talking about a wrap data feed, some of them do support tax statements, some of them don't. So can we provide that function? We're certainly always looking to add more functionality to our data feeds. It can also sometimes depend on the provider, whether they've got the infrastructure to be able to give us that information. And also we look at the quality of the tax statement data. So some of them, particularly since there have been changes to AMIT, there were some issues with the existing infrastructure and the quality of the data they were sending through. So if we're not happy with the quality of the data, we won't accept those tax statements. What I would suggest, Steve, is that you send through a ticket to our feeds operation team with a specific question about your data feed, and they can possibly have a look into that and give you a more tailored answer. Is it possible to share more inputs on pension automation where client maintains multiple pension accounts and how to check the minimum pension requirements for each account while creating rules? So no, Vipin, it's not possible to check that when you're creating the transaction rules, but you can, if you set up a transaction rule for a pension and select the so if I'll just jump into that. If you select the drawdown proportional, so I'll just go into this one. So if you select drawdown proportional, you can actually allocate that automatically up to the minimum. If you've set up a pension review and specified an amount above the minimum, it will actually allocate using the transaction rule up to the specified amount. So it's not possible to track your pension in the transaction rules screen, but it is possible to automate your pension processing, and that would be via a pension review each year. There's another question, how to create a transaction rule for pension drawdown equally to members, from Harish. Well, you use the drawdown payment proportional, you select the pension accounts which you want to match off, and it will apply, as I said, the minimum or a specified amount if you've created a pension review. So I think there are still a couple more questions. I might answer one or two more. So sometimes from Simar, sometimes the dividends received do not match the feeds. It's usually out by a few cents. How do we fix the issue most effectively? So generally, I think, Simar, that generally refer or applies to distributions more so than dividends. With those distributions, the reason it kind of doesn't match, it's to do with the fact that they declare the distribution and then the payment date is sometime later, but it's not specified when they declare it. So with a dividend, we know what the ex-dividend date, we know what a payment date is, so we can easily prepare the business events according to those two. But with a distribution, we only know what the distribution, the ex-distribution date is. And so if it's more than 7 days, it's not going to auto match, and potentially there might be an issue with roundings because some of those managed funds have units that go up to 5 decimal places. So unfortunately, what you need to do is kind of manually match, but you can use the fit to cash. So if you select the business event, select the cash event, you'll see the fit to cash if it's within 50 cents either side, and then you'll be able to match those off. So that would be the most effective way to answer those ones. So look, we will endeavour to get all of your questions answered if we haven't had a chance to do so yet. So we'll send around a copy of all the questions and our suggested answers after today's webinar. May not be straight away today, but certainly the next couple of days. I'm going to end this now. Thank you for your time, and look forward to seeing you next month.